When people start writing Blade directives, I tend to see a lot of common mistakes and assumptions they make about how it works, particularly around how you should use the arguments you pass into the directive. However, it's not necessarily obvious at first why some of the things that people do are bad and can cause issues, so I want to go over a couple of them and show the flaws. Then we can go over a couple of ways to deal with directive arguments a bit more reliably. Let's start off by just making an example directive. Then we can accept the arguments and dump and die them. But we'll use the splat operator, the three dots, which lets us capture any number of arguments as an array instead of having to explicitly define each argument in the function. Now if we go into our view and run this, we should see it dumps the argument we passed in. And it seems fine at first, but pay close attention. The string itself actually has the quote marks in it that we used in the view. That's super important because it means we probably don't want to do something like passing the expression straight into a function and return it. For example, if we had a directive that transformed something into uppercase, we might do this. And let's make sure that we clear the compiled view file. So this means that the quote marks show up in the output too, which we obviously don't want, and this would have other bad effects too. It's really important to remember, and I can't stress this enough, the code that runs in our callback here is happening at the compile time. When we return a string from our callback, that goes into the compiled PHP view file, not the rendered view that makes it to the user's browser. So instead of running the string to upper function directly in our callback, we should return a string of PHP code that'll do it, because then this echo string to upper statement will be run when we try to render the view for a user. And now we can see we've processed the arguments without having the quotes show up in the rendered view file. Anyway, let's just go back into dying and dumping the arguments. If we go and pass another argument into the directive and rerun it, you might expect that array of arguments to now have two entries. But it's still just one. No matter how many arguments we pass the directive in our Blade file, our callback will only ever get a single argument, which is a string representation of all the arguments. And commonly we just call this argument the expression. So the question is, how do you split up the different arguments so that you can use them separately in your directive? Maybe you want to pass the first argument into one function and echo the second argument, or something completely different, whatever your directive wants to do with them. The first thing you might think about doing is exploding the string on commas to separate them out. At a glance, it seems like that would work fine. We've now got an array of two elements, just as we thought we would, but that's still super naive and has a ton of problems. Notably, what if we had other commas in there? Maybe a string with a comma inside it, or an array of elements as a single argument. And while what we passed into our directive was originally valid PHP, now exploding it just doesn't really make sense. We end up with odd characters here and there, and it just doesn't work. So you might rethink it. How do we make sure it passes valid PHP code in two separate arguments for us? Well, PHP already has a function to do that for us. We can just use the eval function to evaluate it. We can put the expression in an array, assign it to a variable, and then dump its contents. And if we run this, it looks like it's worked perfectly. Now we've got two arguments, one of which is an array. They're real PHP values and not just strings with quotes wrapped around them. And this would be fun for everything, right? If eval should be able to pass all PHP code just the same. Well, not quite. Let's go back to our view and instead pass a variable into our directive. We can assign one inline here, but normally this variable might come from your controller or whatever's passing it in. Now when we run the code, we get an undefined variable name. But hang on, we've defined it just here, right? Why isn't it working? Well, remember that our callback is running at the compile time. It's a closure and it doesn't have scope of any of the variables in the view, and there's not really any way to get that either. So eval won't work for us either. At least not if we want our directive to be reliable and work with anything that we might pass it in. So what can we do? Well, let's take a look at one of the directives built into Laravel's core to see how it does it. There's a really handy one added by Caleb Porzio, the error directive, which we can find in the compiles errors trait. And looking at this, we can see exactly what it does to handle this itself. It gets the expression, then in the PHP code that it returns as a string, it assigns the expression to an array inside a variable. This way, anything else that needs access to any of the arguments can do so inside the compile view. So it gets run at rendering time instead of at compile time. Let's try that out in our own directive. Now we can see if we die and dump in the rendering stage instead of the compile stage, we actually have the variable in scope, and that makes it to our die and dump statement. And now we can use those arguments separately however we want to. For example, if we just wanted to uppercase the second argument. And we need to remember to clear the compiled view file. And now that works exactly as we want. And then when we're writing directives like this and defining our own variables, we should probably be responsible and clean up any variables that we made in the process by unsetting them, so they can't affect any code after our directive. And this is a pretty reliable way to do it, especially if you explicitly need to run code in the scope of the view itself. But what if you just wanted a helper function that returned a string that you can render? Maybe you don't need to write custom if statements or affect the flow of PHP code in your directive. It can become a bit of a hassle to write all your directive code inside a string. You have to figure out what to escape and make sure it's all being handled right, and for longer, more complicated directives, that might be more hassle than it's worth. Well, another option you've got is you can still just pass the whole expression to a function and call that. Let's make a new utils class with a static function to handle our code. Now our directive can just call that and pass in the expression. And this way, each of the expression's arguments will end up in our function as real PHP values, not strings with quotes around them. And we can go as far as to type in the function or do whatever else we need to verify that it's all okay, instead of just letting anything through. So yeah, just make sure that when you're writing your custom directives that you remember there's a difference between running the code when the view is being compiled and when the view is being rendered. Make sure that you're handling expressions properly and that they're just not going to break in some unexpected way later down the line, and you should be good.